I had dragged 3 dying things out of the marsh in my life, and every one of them had the decency to be an animal. The 4th was a man. I found him the way I found all of them. By the sound. The marsh at the edge of my land makes its own noise. Reeds and water and the small business of frogs. And after 11 winters out here alone, I knew the difference between that and the noise a thing makes when it is leaving the world. This was that. A wet, careful breathing, with a catch in it like a door that will not quite close. He was face down in the black water, with one arm hooked over a fallen alder, which was the only reason the marsh had not already swallowed him. There was a wound under his ribs that someone had put there on purpose, and a second one along his shoulder, and his blood had gone out into the water in a long dark ribbon a wiser woman would have read as a warning. I am not always a wiser woman. I got my hands under his arms and I hauled, and he was heavier than any man has the right to be, and somewhere in the hauling he came half awake and said a word into the mud that I did not catch, and then he was out again. It took me the better part of an hour to get him up the bank, across the yard, and over my own threshold. And by the end of it I was sitting on my floor with a stranger's head in my lap, and no idea at all what I had just decided. The dog who lives in my woodshed put his nose around the door, took one look, and left. Even he knew better. So it was just the 2 of us, and the fire, and the long work of the night. I cut the stiff cloth back from the wound under his ribs, and I will tell you now, that wound should have killed him on the bank, and the fact that it had not was the first strange thing about him, though it was a long way from the last. I cleaned it. I had yarrow and a needle and a length of waxed thread, and I set to closing what could be closed, and I talked while I worked the way you talk to a frightened horse, low and steady and about nothing. Because a body that can hear a voice fights harder to stay. I told him he was a great inconvenience. I told him I had been about to go to bed. I told him that if he died on my floor after all this I would not forgive him, and that I had a goat to milk at dawn and no time to dig a grave. He did not answer, because he was unconscious, which made him the best conversation I had enjoyed in some months. Near the grey hour before dawn the fever came up in him like a tide, and he started to shake, and I banked the fire higher and I held his hand because there was nothing else left to do, and a hand is not nothing. And it was then, with the light going thin and watery at the shutters, that his eyes came open. They did not come open the way a sick man's eyes open. They came open all at once, clear and pale and entirely awake, and they fixed on my face, and whatever he saw there stopped the breath in him. "You came back," he said. His voice was wrecked, but it was certain. There was no question in it anywhere. I did not know what to do with that, so I did what I do. I never went anywhere, I told him. "You're the one who turned up in my marsh. You're dead." He said it gently, almost kindly, the way you correct a child who has the year wrong. "They told me you were dead." I looked. His hand turned over in mine and gripped, hard enough to hurt. "You should not have come back here. Of all the places, you should not have come back for me." The fever was talking. I knew that. A man does not lose half his blood in a marsh and wake up sensible. But there was a thing happening under his ruined certainty that I had no name for, and it raised the hair on my arms. "Listen to me," he said, and his eyes were already losing their hold, the fever pulling him back under. "You'll regret it. Saving me. Everyone who," the word folded, "run, while you still." And then he was gone again, his grip going slack, his head heavy against my arm. "You're welcome," I told the unconscious king of nothing I knew about. And because the soup had been on the hook since before I found him, and it seemed a waste, I ladled some into the chipped clay bowl my mother left me. The one with the wedge gone out of the rim that catches your lip if you drink careless, and I set it by the fire to keep, in case the dead man wanted feeding when he woke. He slept a full day and a full night. I will tell you the thing I noticed and could not stop noticing in those first days, because it is the whole of how this began. It was not his face, though his face was the kind that makes a room arrange itself around it. It was that the marsh changed while he was in my house. The hunting that goes on out there at night went quiet. The deer came down closer than they have any sense to. And on the second morning, when I went out to the goat, there was a hare laid neat across my doorstone. Not killed by a fox, not killed by a snare. Laid there. Placed with the particular tidiness of a thing that wanted me to find it. I am a woman who has lived alone a long time. I know the difference between a gift and an accident. I just did not yet know who was giving it. He woke for true on the third day, and he was a different man, with the fever gone, quieter and harder, and watching everything in my single room the way a man watches a road he expects trouble on. He told me his name was Halvar, and nothing else. He told me he could not pay me, and I told him I had not asked, and something went across his face at that, quick and gone, that I filed away. How long? He said. 3 days. You'll not be walking for 10. I don't have 10. Then you'll die, I said, pleasantly, and handed him the chipped bowl. Sit up. You've bled enough to fill a well, and you weigh nothing, and I'll not carry you twice. He looked at the bowl. He looked at me. There was a long moment where I watched a man who was plainly accustomed to being obeyed try to find the shape of a situation in which a marsh witch was giving him orders over barley soup, and fail, and decide. I saw him decide. To drink the soup. He drank it from the chipped side, because I had handed it to him turned that way on purpose, to see what he would do. He did not so much as flinch at the rough rim. A man who has drunk from worse, then, I added that to the small pile of things I knew about Halvar that did not fit a marsh. It was that night, sitting up against the wall with more colour in him, that he asked me my name, and I gave it, Vesna, and he repeated it once, low, and then said a thing that turned the room over. There's a stream behind the alders, he said. It runs east of the dead oak, the one the lightning split. You sing to the goat in the mornings. The goat's name is Pell. I had told him none of that. I had told him none of it, and I had not sung that morning, and the dog was the only living soul in 11 winters who had heard me name the goat. How do you know that? It did not come out as a question. It came out flat, because my heart had started going hard, and I did not want him to hear it. He was quiet for a long moment, looking at his own hands. Because I have been dreaming this house for 2 years, he said. I thought it was a place that had died with someone. I thought you were a grief I couldn't put down. He looked up, and there was something close to fear in it, in the face of a man I would later learn fewer than a dozen people had ever seen afraid. And now I'm sitting in it, with you handing me soup, and I do not understand what that means, except that it is the worst possible thing that could have happened to either of us. I want to tell you I had a clever answer. I am usually good for one. I had nothing. I sat in my own house with my own fire and felt the floor I had stood on for 11 years tilt very gently under me. And I could not have told you which way was down. You and I both, Halvar, I did not say. I got up and put more water on instead, because that is a thing the hands can do when the rest of you has gone somewhere it cannot account for. And while it heated, I made myself a promise, the kind you make to keep from running. I would find out who this man actually was before I let myself feel one more thing about him. The men came the very next morning, and they came hunting. I heard the horses before I saw them. 4 of them, coming slow along the marsh track, which is no track at all, and tells you the riders were following something more reliable than a road. I had Halva in the loft under the eaves before the first one dismounted, with the ladder pulled up and a horsehair blanket over the worst of the blood on my floor, and the chipped bowl rinsed and innocent on its shelf. The man who knocked was courteous in the way of men who have never once needed to be. He wore good iron under a plain cloak, which is a thing a careful man does, and he had a voice like warm oil, and he told me his lord was searching the country for a brother lost to a hunting accident, gravely hurt, not in his right mind. A reward, he said, for word of any stranger. A great reward. What's the brother's name? I asked, in case he wanders past. The courteous man smiled at me and did not give it. And your lord's name, I said, in case I need to send word. Cregan, he said. Of the iron hold, and he watched my face when he said it the way a man watches a snare he has just set. I have a good face for this. 11 winters alone will teach you to give a stranger exactly nothing. I told him I'd seen no one but the heron, and I sell him my eggs, and the courteous man laughed, and his eyes went past me into the room, to the 2 bowls drying by the basin, where there should have been one. I had washed the chipped bowl. I had not thought to hide the second. He looked at it a heartbeat too long. I felt the whole night I had spent keeping a stranger alive come down to that one stupid bowl, and I did the only thing left. I picked up my milking pail, stepped past him into the yard as if he were furniture, and said over my shoulder that if he wanted to question the goat he was welcome, but Pell bites, and I kept walking, and I did not look back to see if he followed, because looking back is how they know. He did not follow. Hooves, after a while. Then, nothing. I climbed the ladder with my hands shaking, and found Halva awake in the dark of the loft, with my boning knife in his good hand, held like a man who knew the weight of it, his eyes on the square of light where I came up. Cregan, he said. Not a question. You know him. He's my war captain. A pause that cost him. He was. He put the iron in my ribs himself, on the high pass, and rode home to tell my hold I died on a hunt. His jaw worked. I am the lost brother. There is no brother. There is only the man who needs me to stay dead long enough to take a crown that isn't his. And there it was. The whole shape of it dropped into place, and I understood at last why a wound that should have killed him hadn't, and why the marsh went quiet for him, and why a man drank from a beggar's chipped bowl without a flicker. You're the Iron King, I said. I was, 3 days ago. He looked at the knife in his hand, then at me, and the corner of his ruined mouth did something that on a well man might have been a smile. Now I appear to be a marsh witch's patient, who can't lift a soup spoon. Fortune's turn. I should have been afraid. A dead king in my loft, and his murderer's hounds on my track. There is no version of that a sensible woman survives. But the thing I felt, standing on that ladder, was not fear. It was the floor tilting again, harder this time, and the slow, furious certainty of a woman who has just realized exactly how much trouble she has decided to be in. Get up, I said. We're moving you tonight. He'll be back, and next time he'll bring more than 4. Vesna. He said my name the way he'd said it the first night, certain, like a fact he'd known a long while. You don't owe me this. You could put me back in the marsh and have your life again by morning. I'd think no worse of you. I'd think better. I know. Then why? I looked at him a long moment. There were a great many true answers, and most of them were dangerous, so I gave him the one that was both true and safe. Because I already paid for the thread, I said, and went down the ladder to pack. I'll pause us there a breath, while she packs, and before the rest of it, because if you've stayed with me this far, through the marsh and the soup, and a dead king turning out not to be dead, then I think you'd want the next of these to find you. The only way it will is if you follow along. There, that's the whole of my asking. Now, that night, and the talking, and the part of this I'd keep if I could keep only one of them. We did not move him that night, because the fever came back with the dusk and took the strength out of his legs, and a man who cannot stand cannot be hidden in a marsh. So we waited, and we talked, and that is the part of this I would keep if I could keep only one part. He talked like a man who had not been allowed to in years. He told me about the crown that had come to him too young, and the war captain he'd trusted because his father had trusted him, and the slow understanding that the men closest to a king are the ones with the shortest road to his throat. He told me he had never taken a Luna, never let himself want one, because a king's chosen mate is a king's softest place, and he had enemies enough to know they would aim for her first. He had decided, years ago, to want nothing the world could use against him. And how, I asked, has that been working out? He looked at me across my own fire, in my own house, with my own thread holding his ribs together, and he started to laugh, and it pulled the wound and made him swear, and he laughed anyway, low and helpless, and I thought, oh no, not this, not him. There was a face, he said, when he had his breath. These 2 years. In the dreaming, I told you I thought it was a grief, a woman I'd loved and lost, except I'd never lost anyone, so I decided my mind had made her up to punish me for the wanting. He was not laughing now. I knew the stream behind your alders before I ever bled into it, Vesna. I knew your goat's name. I have been dreaming my way to this house for 2 years, and I woke up in it, and you were real. The wolf knows first. Every grandmother's tale says so, and I had never once believed it, and here it was in my house, drinking my soup. That's not grief, I said softly. That's the bond. Your wolf went looking for me before either of us had the sense to. Yes, he said. I worked that out about an hour ago. A breath. I am trying to be sorry about it. For your sake. I find I'm not managing. I did not go to him. I want that understood. There was a whole room between us, and I kept it there, the way you keep your hand back from a fire you have decided not to touch. But I sat down on my side of that fire, and I did not send him to the loft, and we stayed up until the shutters went grey, talking about nothing and everything. 2 people on opposite sides of a hearth, not closing the distance, both of us knowing exactly how short it was. That was the night I stopped pretending I would put him back in the marsh. It was the goat that nearly got us killed. 3 mornings on, Halva strong enough to stand, and not yet strong enough to run, Pell went missing from her tether, and I went out into the reeds after her like a fool, with my head full of a king, instead of my own danger. And I came around the dead oak and walked straight into Cregan. Not his courteous man. Cregan himself, off his horse, with 2 others, close enough that I could see he had his brother's colouring, and none of his brother's stillness, a handsome, hungry, restless face, the face of a man who has wanted a thing his whole life and finally got close. He had Pell by the rope. He had been waiting. The egg woman, he said. With 2 bowls. He smiled. I wondered. I have been afraid in my life. I had never been afraid the way I was afraid in that half-second, with no door behind me and no clever word in my mouth, and a man between me and the only living soul I'd let matter in 11 years. And then a strange cold calm came down over all of it, the way it does, and I heard myself say, "You put iron in your own king," and rode home crying. And now you're holding my goat. I let that sit. He's going to be so disappointed in you. He trusted you, you know. He told me. Of all the people he could have named with a knife in him, dying, he named you, not as the one who did it. As the one he couldn't believe would. It was a guess. It was a blade made of a guess, and I watched it go in. Cregan's face did a thing then that I would not have traded for my own safety. For one heartbeat the hunger went out of it, and underneath was a boy who had loved someone and chosen wrong, and knew it, and could not now go back. Then it closed over, harder than before, and he let go of the goat and came toward me. And I understood I had bought myself nothing but the satisfaction of being right, which is a poor coin to die holding. He got one hand on my arm, and the marsh stood up out of the water behind him. I have no better way to tell it. One moment there were 3 men and a goat, and me. And the next there was a wolf the size of a draft horse, where the reeds had been, soaked black, swaying on legs that should not have held it, with my thread in its shoulder, and its king's pale, furious eyes. And Cregan's men ran. Simply ran, because there are things the body decides before the mind is asked. Cregan did not run. Cregan turned and reached for his iron, and was not fast enough, because a dying wolf that has decided to spend the last of itself is faster than a whole man. It was over in less time than it takes to tell. I will spare you the particulars. The marsh took care of the rest, the way it does. When it was done, the wolf came apart back into the man, and Halvar went down in the black water on his hands and knees with every wound he had broken open, and the bond between us screaming so loud I felt it in my own teeth. And I was already running, already in the water, already pulling my 3rd dying thing out of that marsh, except he was the 4th, and he was a king. And I was done pretending I did not love him. "You absolute fool," I said into his soaked hair, holding his head up out of the water the way I had the first night. "You can't even stand. You shifted. You could have died for a goat." "Not for the goat," he managed. "I know it wasn't for the goat," I said, and got him up the bank for the 2nd time in my life. And this time I did not promise myself I would find out who he was first. There was no first left. There was only the 2nd time, and the bank, and the long walk home with a king's arm over my shoulders and his blood on my hands. Again, still, the same thread, the same chipped bowl waiting on the shelf, and the whole impossible weight of him learning to lean on me as if he had been practicing it in his sleep for 2 years. Which, I suppose he had. It would be a tidy place to end. It was not the end. A dead king who is suddenly not dead is not a happy ending. It is a problem with a crown on it, and the problem had to be carried back to the Ironhold and set down in front of 300 people who had spent a fortnight in mourning and a fortnight learning to call Cregan their lord. So we went. It took 11 days for him to be strong enough, and it took every one of those days for me to lose every argument about whether I would come. He had a man still loyal in the hold, Edric, who had been his father's man and who had refused to swear to Cregan and paid for it with the dungeon, and was, when Halvar's quiet word reached him, very much still alive, and very much done waiting. Between Edric inside and the truth walking up the road outside, we had a chance. A poor one. The kind you take. I will not pretend I belonged in that hall. I walked into the great hall of the Iron Kings in my marsh boots with reed mud still on the hem, the lowest born soul in a room built to keep my kind out of it, and 300 faces turned and decided in a single breath that I was no one. I had spent 11 years being no one. I found, that day, that I had stopped being able to do it. Cregan sat in a chair that was not his, with the look of a man who has nearly finished a long climb. And then the doors at the far end opened, and his king walked in on his own 2 feet, thinner, greyer, leaning on a healer's apprentice from the marsh and not troubling to hide it. And the whole hall made a sound I have never heard before or since, the sound 300 people make when the dead come back. What happened next was law and blood, and the old harsh business of wolves, and Edric's men coming up out of the dark where Cregan thought he'd buried them, and I will let you imagine most of it. But here is the part that was mine. Cregan, cornered, with his lie coming down around him, did the last thing a cornered man does. He reached for the nearest thing that would hurt his king most. He had marked, in the first moment, exactly what Halvar was leaning on. And he came across that dice not for the crown and not for the king, but for me, with a blade, fast, in front of everyone, because a dead witch is a simple thing, and a king who has just lost his soft place is a broken one. I saw it come. And I did the thing I have done my whole life, the only useful thing I know. I did not freeze. I stepped in. Not away, in, the way you step toward the goat that's about to bolt. And I got my 2 hands on his arm and I held, the way I had held a dying man over black water. And the blade went through the meat of my palm instead of through me. And I felt the bone of my own hand take his weight, and I did not let go. It brought a heartbeat. A heartbeat was all Halvar needed. He crossed that dace faster than a wounded man should be able to move, and he took his war captain by the throat in front of the whole watching hold, and he did not kill him. That is the thing they still talk about, in the Iron Hold, the king who did not kill the man who'd murdered him. He set him down before his own court, and he said, in a voice the rafters carried, that Cregan would live, and be known, and be nothing, exiled past the last marker, with the mark of an oath-breaker cut where every pack from here to the sea would read it. Which is worse. Anyone who has lived among wolves will tell you that is worse. And then, with my blood running off my hand onto the stones of his great hall, in front of 300 people who had decided I was no one, the Iron King turned and went down on one knee to a marsh witch. This is the woman who pulled me out of the dark, he said. Twice. She owes this hold nothing, and it owes her everything, and she will be called Luna in it, and any wolf who has a word to say about the mud on her boots may say it to me. He looked up at me, and the certainty was back in his face. The same certainty from the first grey morning. Except now, we both knew its name. If she'll have a half-dead king and a kingdom that's about to be a great deal of work. The hall was silent. My hand was bleeding. Somewhere outside a heron was making its idiot noise. You should have led with the kingdom, I told him. I drive a hard bargain. It is a strange thing to make 300 terrified wolves laugh. I recommend it. He kissed me there on the dice, and I will not tell you about it, except to say that something I had bricked up 11 winters ago came down all at once, quiet, like a wall that had only been waiting for someone to lean on it. And when it was done, I was crying and laughing at the same time, and so, I noticed, was the king of the Iron Hold, which his court will also never let him forget. The marsh witch became the Luna. There is more to it than that. There is always more. The whispers and the high-born daughters, and the slow grinding work of a court learning to bow to mud, but those are other nights' stories. This is the part I keep. A year on, near to the day, there is a chair beside the king's at the high table of the Iron Hold, and the woman in it has reed mud on the hem of a very fine dress, because some habits a marsh teaches you do not wash out. There is a goat in the royal stable that bites anyone but me. There is a long pale scar through my right palm that aches before rain, and a matching one along the king's ribs, set in waxed thread by firelight, that he shows to every visiting lord who needs reminding where his Luna comes from. And in the middle of that high table, between the silver and the good glass, and all the heavy gold a hold can put out to impress its rivals, there is a chipped clay bowl with a wedge gone out of the rim. The servants tried to take it away a dozen times. The king kept fetching it back. He drinks from the chipped side. He has never once told the court why, and I have never once told them either. And let them wonder, let the whole proud Iron Hold wonder why their unkillable king reaches past the gold every single night for a beggar's broken bowl. I know why. He woke up in the dark and thought I was a ghost, and I handed him soup and made him real, and he has been drinking from the broken side of things ever since, because it was the broken side that saved his life. So tell me, did you see it coming? that the ghost was never a grief at all. And wherever you're listening from tonight, marsh or hall or somewhere with no heron to keep you up, leave the door unlatched and the fire low. Follow along, and I'll have another for you next week, her side of it, the way these are always told. The quiet women, it turns out, are the strongest wolves in the room. I always suspected. Now I have a crown that says so.